Criminality is bipartisan. Hypocrisy, contradiction, open borders, and insanity is destroying America. Whether you are a Fox News slut, an MSNBC whore, or live in the euphoric bliss of porno pop culture ignorance, you're being prostituted by the wretched, evil pimps of the New World Order. Like pimps at the local bus station, these vampires allure their prey with promises and hopes while sucking lifeblood and poisoning minds with powerful agendas promoted by the many cultural forces that permeate our world. These puppets are nothing more than extravagantly wealthy sluts, whores to their benefactors, the pimp elite of the New World Order. With all of the trillions and trillions spent on social justice issues, we are far worse off as a nation than we were 100 years ago. Far worse off, socially, morally, and economically, burdened with nearly $20 trillion of debt and more than 100 million people on some kind of government program for assistance. Millions are illegal aliens. In all, almost 50 million are on food stamps. With all good intentions and claims of helping the worker and the poor and underserved, history has proven that in practice, progressivism, socialism, communism, fascism, call them what you like, all benefit one, banks, and two, corporations, and an elite few. This is what we see today. The result, wealth is squandered and or filtered up to the top of the food chain, while the masses receive scraps. History has proven this, time and again. This is quickly becoming the norm in this neo-feudal age. Starting in the 1930s through the 1960s, Antonio Gramsci wrote that there would be a long march through the institutions, and that instead of violent revolution, the West would become socialist by convincing Western minds, which would be achieved by infiltrating the institutions. Understanding what we are facing today, we must look to the past. By 1960, the Soviet Union had the following goals written down in relation to American institutions. Overload the welfare system to cause a crisis. Obtain peace through disarmament. Make America give foreign aid to its own enemies. Make America support the UN. Put leftist judges on the Supreme Court. Present homosexuality as normal. Place leftist professors in the universities. Allow the media to be infiltrated. Promote pornography. Prevent children from saying grace in school. Promote gun control. Use radical environmentalism to destroy U.S. industry. Distort biblical Christianity. Now, what gets me about all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is exactly what was documented in 1960. And here we are, some 55 years later, and look at this. Look at where we are. I'm just stunned how much of this has come to pass, and much of it has only come after 9/11. After 9/11 happened, everything seemed to speed up. All of the programs, all of these plans that they had been put into place, and all of these things are continue to be put into place as we have the Jade Helms exercises occurring right now. We'll see what that psyop is about. Things are crazy. Talking about distorting biblical Christianity, have you seen the History Channel show Ancient Aliens? Well, I didn't know, but according to the History Channel, Jesus and the angels are aliens. This long-planned deception was craftily laid out by the Soviets in the early 60s and has worked marvelously well. Clearly, this is not just a coincidence that these things have occurred. You just have to take a look at the warnings that we had. In 1983, Yuri Bezmenov defected. He was a KGB operative who defected.
But in reality, the main
warned about all
of the
this.
KGB is not in the area of intelligence at all. According to my opinion and opinion of many defectors of my caliber, only about 15% of time, money, and manpower is spent on espionage as such. The other 85% is a slow process which we call either ideological subversion or active measures, активные мероприятия in the language of the KGB, or psychological warfare. What it basically means is to change the perception of reality of every American to such an extent that despite of the abundance of information, no one is able to come to sensible conclusions in the interests of defending themselves, their families, their community, and their country. It's a great brainwashing process which goes very slow, and it's divided in 4 basic stages. The first one being demoralization. It takes from 15 to 20 years to demoralize a nation. Why that many years? Because this is the minimum number of years which requires to educate one generation of students in the country of your enemy, exposed to the ideology of the enemy. In other words, Marxism-Leninism ideology is being pumped into the soft heads of at least 3 generations of American students without being challenged or counterbalanced by the basic values of Americanism, American patriotism. The result you can see. Most of the people who graduated in the 60s, dropouts or half-baked intellectuals, are now occupying the positions of power in the government, civil service, business, mass media, educational system. You are stuck with them. You cannot get rid of them. They are contaminated. They are programmed to think and react to certain stimuli in a certain pattern. You cannot change their mind, even if you expose them to authentic information, even if you prove that white is white and black is black, you still cannot change the basic perception and the logic of behavior. In other words, these people, the process of demoralization is complete and irreversible. To get rid society of these people, you need another 20 or 15 years to educate a new generation of patriotically minded and common sense people who would be acting in favor and in the interests of the United States society.
And yet these people who've been programmed and, as you say, in place, and
Yes.
who are favorable to an opening with the Soviet concept, these are the very people who would be marked for extermination in this country?
Most of them, yes. Simply because the psychological shock when they will see in future what the beautiful society of equality and social justice means in practice, obviously they will revolt. They will be very unhappy, frustrated people. And the Marxist-Leninist regime does not tolerate these people. Obviously they will join the links of dissenters, dissidents. Unlike in present United States, there will be no place for dissent in future Marxist-Leninist America. Here you can get popular like Daniel Ellsberg and filthy rich like Jane Fonda for being dissident, for criticizing your Pentagon. In future, these people will be simply squashed like cockroaches. Nobody is going to pay them nothing for their beautiful, noble ideas of equality. This they don't understand, and it will be a greatest shock for them, of course. The demoralization process in the United States is basically completed already. For the last 25 years. Actually, it's overfulfilled, because demoralization now reaches such areas where previously not even Comrade Andropov and all his experts would even dream of such a tremendous success. Most of it is done by Americans to Americans, thanks to lack of moral standards. As I mentioned before, exposure to true information does not matter anymore. A person who was demoralized is unable to assess true information. The facts tell nothing to him. Even if I shower him with information, with authentic proof, with documents, with pictures, even if I take him by force to the Soviet Union and show him concentration camp, he will refuse to believe it until he is going to receive a kick in his fat bottom. When a military boot crashes his, then he will understand, but not before that. That's the tragic of the situation of demoralization.
A big part of this social engineering deception is having an open borders policy. For more than 50 years, presidents from both sides of the false left-right paradigm have either complained about the high socioeconomic cost and danger of illegal immigration or pretended to complain for votes, since nothing has ever been done. There is a reason for this. It is all part of the long-term global governance plan to strip away all borders. This is the reason why globalist titans like billionaire Maurice Strong and others have devised Agenda 21, Sustainable Development. Sustainable development. Newspeak for sustainable social control. By the way, Maurice Strong lives in Beijing, China. All of this has been accomplished by the elite swindlers behind the scenes at the United Nations and the Club of Rome. A final continuous rape and pillage of the people, economies, and resources of the world, exploiting contrived problems like global warming, overpopulation, and limits to growth. In truth, it is about collectivizing the natural resources of the world, including humans, and culling the herd. Sounds crazy, right? Consider this. Having an open borders policy has many consequences. But who benefits? Qui bono? Well, as they always say, follow the money. Economist Brian Kaplan, as well as globalists, as well as all globalists, believe that the open borders policy is an efficient, egalitarian, libertarian, utilitarian way to double world GDP, quote unquote. A link to Kaplan's global elite-funded thesis and all of the other content discussed, including the recorded archive of this broadcast, can be found at howardnema.com. As you can see, this is a whole lot more and bigger. As you can see, this is a whole lot more and much bigger than money. It is about creating a manageable neo-feudal society ruled by an authoritarian elite class who are already showing their colors with the many mayhems we are seeing each and every day. America is slowly evolving into Stasi East Germany, with clandestine Big Brother continuously looming over us, and more civil unrest, divisive tactics. Civil unrest fueled by divisive tactics and agendas propagandized by forces behind the scenes in the controlled mainstream media. Racial division, police brutality, gay marriage are all the rage now, pardon the pun. But isn't it true? The concept of open borders is newspeak for the New World Order. One world authoritarian government where the serfs embrace their servitude, loving their glorious utopia that doesn't exist. This utopia and its goals, fairness, equality, world peace, yada yada yada, is nothing more than a psyop, a mind fuck, full of hidden agendas, false information that mask ghastly and sinister long-term intentions. It's a veneer, a cover, a screen. Since the 1960s, a vast network including hundreds of organizations and tens of thousands of grassroots activists, backed by hundreds of millions of dollars from left-wing foundations, have waged a sustained campaign to open America's borders to a mass migration from the Third World. The open borders movement began in the 1960s. By the 1980s, it became an amnesty for illegal aliens issue. By the 1990s, the movement gained traction with more newspeak, globalization, and multilateralism, propaganda that encouraged a world without borders and the demise of the nation state. It takes a village to raise a child. Yes, a borderless village. Globalism is communism, as is progressivism, as is fascism, and Illuminism. They are all one and the same. There is no difference to this trinity of evil. At the center of this movement is the Ford Foundation, the largest tax-exempt foundation in the world, and guided mostly by commie leftovers and today, the boomer left. What on the surface appears to be sincere and noble efforts to educate blacks and minorities, these acts have left them dumbed down. Far worse, 2 generations and counting, education spending continues to increase as test scores continually decline. Good intentions pave the way to hell, or maybe hell is where the intentions come from. In typical bipartisan New World Order fashion, whatever a leader or policymaker presents, the opposite will occur. The Ford Foundation has bankrolled the creation of radical communist groups like the Mexican-American Legal Defense and the Education Fund, known as MALDEF, and the National Council of La Raza, that's La Raza, who control the Mexican border and the drugs and all the things going on over there and the gun running and all that stuff. The Ford Foundation has also given tons to the American Civil Liberties Union and promoted radical Marxist organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, who are overtly hostile to American values and purposes. Ford was also the prime funder of multiculturalism in college and university programs, whose effect was to undermine the concept of national identity. And they have really done this very effectively. As you can see, our national identity is vanishing. And as Arthur Schlesinger pointed out in his celebrated essay, The Disuniting of America, Reflections on a Multicultural Society, we can see that these words have come to light, where now the truth is that everything is all about multiculturalism. We don't have a national identity. They're moving, they're totally taking it away. Slowly, incrementally. And the elite rule by generational bloodlines. Arthur Schlesinger's spawn, Arthur Jr., is a good example. Jr. was famously quoted as saying, "We are not going to achieve a new world order without paying for it in blood as well as in words and money." The campaign to radically change American values and culture through mass immigration and the political mobilization of the alienated presents a danger to the American people that parallels the current and ongoing anti-American agendas of the Islamic Jihad. Since the 1950s, the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Education Fund, that's MALDEF, I'm just going to call them MALDEF from now on, and the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, have figured most prominently in the Ford Foundation's strategy to create a large, active, pro-open borders movement. By 1970, MALDEF had already acquired a militant image and had begun advocating bilingual education as a right due the Hispanic community. This is why we have to push 1 for English and 2 for Spanish. Today, MALDEF is the leading Hispanic civil rights organization with regional offices in Atlanta, Los Angeles, San Antonio, Chicago, and Phoenix, Washington, D.C., and satellite offices, as I mentioned, in Sacramento, Phoenix, Albuquerque, and Houston. MALDEF has a budget of $6.2 million annually and a staff of 75 employees, which includes 22 attorneys. MALDEF has been headed by Antonia Hernandez since 1985. She came to the group after serving on the Democratic staff of the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee. She's a trustee of the Rockefeller Foundation and sits on the Senior Advisory Committee of the John F. Kennedy Institute of Politics at Harvard University, the Pacific Council for International Policy, and the Commission on Presidential Debates. What about that? Boy, Antonia Hernandez, she's really connected since 1985, reigning. Okay, for its first 3 decades, virtually all of the funding from MALDEF came from the Ford Foundation, which shaped its leadership and agendas as dictated by the foundation.
And what we were able to bring forward was that what we had uncovered was the determination of these large endowed foundations through their trustees to actually get control over the content of American education.
There's quite a bit of publicity given to your conversation with Rowan Gaither. Would you please tell us who he was and what was that conversation you had with him?
Rowan Gaither was at that time president of the Ford Foundation. And Mr. Gaither had sent for me when I found it convenient to be in New York, asked me to call upon him at his office, which I did. And on arrival, after a few amenities, Mr. Gaither said, "Mr. Dodd, we've asked you to come up here today because we thought that possibly off the record you would tell us why the Congress is interested in the activities of foundations such as ourselves. And before I could think of how I would reply to that statement, Mr. Gaither then went on voluntarily and stated, he said, "Mr. Dodd, all of us that have a hand in the making of policies here have had experience either with the OSS during the war or the European Economic Administration after the war. We've had experience operating under directives, and these directives emanate and did emanate from the White House. Now we still operate under just such directives. Would you like to know what the substance of these directives is?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Gaither, I'd like very much to know." Whereupon he made this statement to me, namely, "Mr. Dodd, we here operate on in response to similar directives, the substance of which is that we shall use our grant-making power so to alter life in the United States that it can be comfortably merged with the Soviet Union." Well, parenthetically, Mr. Griffin, I nearly fell off the chair. I, of course, didn't, but my response to Mr. Gaither then was, "Well, Mr. Gaither, I can now answer your first question. You forced the Congress of the United States to spend $150,000 to find out what you just told me. So why don't you I said, of course, legally you're entitled to make grants for this purpose, but I don't think you're entitled to withhold that information from the people of the country to whom you're indebted for your tax exemption. So why don't you tell the people of the country that's what you told me?" And his answer was, "We would not think of doing any such thing." So then I said, "Well, Mr. Gaither, obviously you forced the Congress to spend this money in order to find out what you've just told me."
Mr. Dodd, you have spoken before about some interesting things that were discovered by Catherine Casey at the Carnegie Endowment. Can you tell us that story, please?
Yes, I'm glad to, Mr. Griffin. This experience that you have just referred to came about in response to a letter which I had written to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, asking certain questions and gathering certain information. And on the arrival of that letter, Dr. Johnson, who was then president of the Carnegie Endowment, telephoned me and said, "Did I ever come up to New York?" And I said, "Yes, I did, more or less each weekend." And he said, "Well, when you're next here, will you drop in and see us?" Which I did. And again, on arrival at the office of the endowment, I found myself in the presence of Dr. Joseph Johnson, the president, who was a successor to Alger Hiss, two vice presidents, and their own counsel, a partner in the firm, Sullivan and Cromwell. And Dr. Johnson said, after, again, amenities, "Mr. Dodd, we have your letter. We can answer all those questions, but it'd be a great deal of trouble. And we have a counter-suggestion. And our counter-suggestion is that if you can spare a member of your staff for 2 weeks and send that member up to New York, we will give to that member a room in the library and the minute books of this foundation since its inception. And we think that whatever you want to find out or the Congress wants to find out will be obvious from those minutes." Well, my first reaction was they'd lost their mind. I had a pretty good idea of what those minutes would contain, but I realized that Dr. Johnson had only been in office 2 years, and the vice presidents were relatively young men, and counsel seemed to be also a young man, and I guessed that probably they'd never read the minutes themselves. And so I said I had somebody, I would take it. I would accept their offer, and I went back to Washington, and I selected the member of my staff who was on my staff, having been a practicing attorney in Washington, but she was on my staff to see to it that I didn't break any congressional procedures or rules. In addition to which, she was unsympathetic to the purpose of the investigation. She was level-headed and a very reasonably brilliant, capable lady. And her attitude toward the investigation was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, in the face of that sincere conviction of Catherine's, I went out of my way not to prejudice her in any way. But I did explain to her that she couldn't possibly cover 50 years of handwritten minutes in 2 weeks. So she would have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods of time to concentrate on. And off she went to New York. She came back at the end of 2 weeks with the following in the way of, on dictaphone belts. We are now at the year 1908, which was the year that the Carnegie began operations. And in that year, the trustees, meeting for the first time, raised a specific question, which they discussed throughout the balance of the year in a very learned fashion. And the question is there any means known more effective than war, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people? And they conclude that no more effective means than war to that end is known to humanity. So then in 1909 they raised the second question and discussed it, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, I doubt at that time if there was any subject more removed from the thinking of most of the people of this country than its involvement in a war. There were intermittent shows in the Balkans, but I doubt very much if many people even knew where the Balkans was. Then finally, they answer that question as follows. We must control the State Department. And then that very naturally raises the question of how do we do that? And they answer it by saying we must take over it and control the diplomatic machinery of this country. And finally they resolve to aim at that as an objective. Then time passes, and we are eventually in a war, which would have been World War I. And at that time, they record on their minutes a shocking report in which they dispatched to President Wilson a telegram cautioning him to see that the war does not end too quickly. And finally, of course, we are, the war is over. At that time, their interest shifts over to preventing what they call a reversion of life in the United States to what it was prior to 1914, when World War I broke out. And they arrive at that point, they come to the conclusion that to prevent a reversion, we must control education in the United States. And they realize that that's a pretty big task. So to them it is too big for them alone, so they approach the Rockefeller Foundation with the suggestion that that portion of education which could be considered domestic be handled by the Rockefeller Foundation, and that portion which is international should be handled by the endowment. And they then decide that the key to the success of these two operations lay in an alteration in the teaching of American history. So they approach 4 of the then most prominent teachers of American history in the country, people like Charles and Mary Bird, and their suggestion to them is, will they alter the manner in which they present this subject, and they get turned down flat. So they then decide that it is necessary for them to do, as they say, build our own stable of historians. And then they approach the Guggenheim Foundation, which specializes in fellowships, and say, when we find young men in the process of studying for doctorates in the field of American history, and we feel that they are the right caliber, will you grant them fellowships on our say-so? And the answer is yes. So under that condition, eventually they assemble 20. And they take this 20 potential teachers of American history to London, and there they're briefed into what is expected of them when, as and if they secure appointments in keeping with the doctorates they will have earned. And that group of 20 historians ultimately becomes the nucleus of the American Historical Association. And then toward the end of the 1920s, the endowment grants to the American Historical Association $400,000 for a study of our history in a manner which points to what can this country can it look forward to in the future. And that culminates in a 7-volume study, the last volume of which is, of course, in essence a summary of the contents of the other 6. And the essence of the last volume is the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. That's the story that ultimately grew out of, and of course was what could have been presented by the members of this congressional committee to the Congress as a whole for just exactly what it said. But they never got to that point.
This is the story that emerged from the minutes of the Carnegie Fund.
That's right.
The Carnegie Endowment
That's
Fund.
right.
And so...
It was official to that extent.
I see. And Catherine Casey brought all of these back in the form of dictated notes or verbatim readings of the minutes.
On dictaphone belts.
Are those in existence today?
I don't know. But if they are, they're somewhere in the archives under the control of the Congress, House of Representatives.
How many people actually heard those, or were they typed up transcripts made of them? How many people actually heard those recordings?
Oh, 3 maybe. Myself, my top assistants, and Catherine.
You may drive a Ford today. Did you know Henry Ford was a racist, Hitler-loving Nazi sympathizer, anti-Semitic control freak? Ford created an entire community where his workers and their families lived and worked and were regulated about their personal affairs and habits in the way they lived their lives. The Ford Foundation's first grant to protect the civil liberties of illegal aliens went to the New York Civil Liberties Union in 1982. Today, MALDEF no longer draws a distinction between legal and illegal immigrants and continuously attempts to expand access to driver's licenses without regard to immigration status. A driver's license does more than enable an illegal alien to operate a vehicle. It blurs one's illegal alien status. The ACLU has had no better partner and friend than the Ford Foundation, said Ira Glasser, executive director of the National ACLU at the time. It is fitting that the largest single gift of this effort, and is in fact the largest gift ever given to the ACLU, should come from Ford. What a shock. Almost 7 million illegal aliens were counted in the 2000 census. Today there are close to 20 million. And the powers behind the scenes want more, and they want them to vote. If you can believe it, American University law professor Jamin Raskin has proclaimed non-citizen voting is the suffrage movement of the decade. Again, this is blurring the whole concept of borders, the whole concept of the culture of the United States, our language, like Michael Savage says, borders, language, and culture. It's true. This is America. We have to hold our traditions. Why do all of these other countries, they just blur their traditions? That's not true. They're attacking the American way of life. These communists, these fascists, these socialists, these Nazis. They're all working together to achieve this goal of total control for the elite. And once they have it, oh God, all hell will break loose. So after receiving grant money from the Ford Foundation, the World Policy Institute tasked senior fellow Michelle Wooker on the cause advocating non-citizens the right to vote in New York as a way to update our democracy for global times. You see how they're just setting this whole thing up? And people are buying into this bullshit. They don't even know about the Constitution. They don't teach it to you in school. Or if they do, it's just peripheral. And this whole movement is taking over our education system of our children. It's disgraceful. MALDEF still relies heavily on the Ford Foundation for funding. The current Ford Foundation website lists 8 separate grants to MALDEF totaling $11,085,000. MALDEF has also received funding from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Open Society Institute, the Joyce Foundation, the Rosenberg Foundation, the Joyce Metz Gilmore Foundation, the Nathan Cummings Foundation, and the North Star Fund. These foundations are behind this shift that we have in education, this shift that we have in open borders, this shift that we have in cultural, all of these isms that I've been talking about today. Multiculturalism, please, this whole diversification, all this stuff, all of these terms tied in with the Agenda 21 terms like sustainability and being green energy. I think you have to understand the depth of this deception is so deep that it's at the bottom of the ocean. At the deepest point, it still would go deeper to really understand where we are, and who we're fighting and what they're planning to do and what they're working to do. This is not paranoia. This is an agenda. This is something that they have been working for and are succeeding, because most folks still are unaware and not paying enough attention to what's going on around them, as countries around the world are also doing their own Jade 15 exercises. What are they planning for? Why was there all that activity in FEMA Region 3 a year or so ago? What with all this activity? What are they doing? Why is there so much active, drills that have to be done here in this country? It's unprecedented. Before World War I, did they do this? Did they do these drills before World War II to control the population? Did they do these things? I think not. These dangerous times. But past is prologue. So we look to the past to see where we're headed and where we are. How can you be pro-abortion and anti-capital punishment? I mean, it's just self-contradictory. Support gun control to save children's lives, but the killing of unborn children in the name of convenience, choice, or whatever is okay. Let's say a child survives an abortion and then grows up to commit murder later in life. A liberal will scream injustice if that person is sentenced to death. Insanity. Where is our common sense? Our decency? This has nothing to do with being a liberal or being a conservative. It has to do with having common decency and common sense. Muslims want to kill homosexuals, yet liberals promote that homosexual agenda and Sharia law. If the Muslims take over the United States, they'll start by expunging the land of homosexuals and liberals. Why support any agenda? Why not support individual freedom, property rights, and the right to be left alone? The hypocritical on the left say they're for women's rights, but ignore genital mutilation by Muslims and Sharia law, which allows you to kill your wife. If liberals aren't racist, why do they evaluate and categorize everyone by the color of their skin? Why do they continue to promote abortion when far more blacks are killed by abortion than whites? Why do they continue to promote social programs that enslave blacks, keeping them at or near the poverty level by dumbing them down in school and proliferating their neighborhoods with drugs and liquor stores? Answer: because they need a welfare class to keep that roller coaster heading toward the Cloward-Piven cliff, pumping up that welfare state. The goal is to increase the number of people on welfare, and it's working. The Cloward-Piven strategy: overwhelm the social welfare system to achieve social change through poverty. Look it up, 1966. They were married. Of course, she kept her name because she was a feminist, whatever. And they were both sociologists, professors at Columbia University, and this study came out in 1966. Ah, yes, the Cloward-Piven strategy. This is why our borders are left wide open, despite which puppet is in the White House, be he Demo-rat or Republican. We really have a serious problem in this country. And the problem is we're moving away from its founding principles. We're moving away from morality. Things that are immoral are being called immoral. They're thinning the line between immorality and morality, making it so that almost anything goes. I mean, Miley Cyrus swinging on a ball, naked, getting by with practical pornography in mainstream films. It's moving into it, and now you have mainstream porno actors in mainstream films. This is something that's slowly been going on, and it's going to continue, and it's going to just blur to this one big thing, this one big, anything goes, do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law, as Aleister Crowley said, and it's truly a Luciferian deception. I mean, you don't have to do blood rituals and take an oath to Satan to serve Satan. It's just by you're not realizing how your role is being part of it. And again, I'm not a a holy roller or devout Christian or anything like that. I have my relationship with God and Jesus, and that's my thing. But I'm telling you, this is what's going on. It's happening. We are experiencing a decline in morality, a decline in and that's not just sex. Moral decline in character, and moral decline in ethics, business practices. I mean, just look at the way when you do business in your own life. When you buy things, look at how many times you've been screwed by this retailer or that, or this dealer or that, or this person or that. I mean, there's no honor anymore. Is this all making sense? Because it's happening. We're right in the middle of it. I hope you can see that. Take the time to research all the things I discussed today. Find your own truth. There is only one truth. Seek and you'll find it. Please share this information with everyone you know. I do a live broadcast 3 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on Thursdays. You can check out on UnitedFMRadio.com.